I think we're going to start, if that's okay with everybody. If you can take your seats, we'll start the session. We're going to try to finish a little early because the minister has to leave. So we'll try to have...
You also have to leave.
I also have to leave. So for a very good reason, it's to celebrate the 120th anniversary of the Entente Cordiale between the UK and France. So it's a good excuse. But we'll make it a really efficient conversation, I think. And we've got a great panel. So I'll introduce everyone. We will, I think, do this in English, but if the minister wants to speak in French, obviously that is completely normal. So Jean-Noël Barrot is France's Minister for European Affairs, Vice President of Modem, the political party, and formerly Minister for Digital Transition. And before entering politics, he was an associate professor of finance at MIT's Sloan School of Management. Luigi di Maio, who is next to me, former Italian foreign minister and deputy prime minister, and former leader of the Five Star Movement. He is currently the EU's special representative for the Gulf region, but it's important to know that this evening he's speaking in a personal capacity, not on behalf of his institution. Nils Schmid, on my left, is a deputy in the German Bundestag. He's spokesman for foreign affairs for the SPD parliamentary party, and formerly was finance minister and then deputy minister president of Baden-Württemberg. And Renu van Lanschot, on my right, is the co-founder and president of the Dutch party Volt Europa, and in 2019 he was the head of his party's list in elections to the European Parliament. That's our panel. Our subject is challenging. Are we heading towards a populist Europe? What I'll start by doing is asking the minister and then the other panelists to look at that question and answer, is this inevitable? What does it matter? How does it matter? And what can we do about it? Minister Barrot.
Well, let me first thank Bernard Spitz and Les Gracques for their invitation. Let me tell you that I'm very happy to be on this podium with Nils, Luigi and Rainer. This is a very important question, 2 months ahead of the European elections, and my answer is no. The rise of populism in Europe is not inevitable, and it can be avoided. It can be avoided because Europe can change. And I'm going to try in a few seconds to tell you why I believe this is the case. 7 years ago, Europe seemed totally powerless in front of the big challenges that a large number of Europeans thought that they can only find solutions at the European level, but nothing was moving. The, social dumping, the regulation of big tech, illegal migration, and so on and so forth. Everyone was convinced that the solution had to be European, but nothing was moving and Europe was powerless. In 2017, so 7 years ago, French President Macron pronounced a speech a few hundred meters away from here in La Sorbonne. And in his speech, he decided to break a number of those taboos. And what I'm seeing when I read this speech again is that a number of the taboos that he pointed out, of the commitments he took in this La Sorbonne speech, basically were held. In his speech, he was mentioning posted workers, the regulation of posted workers, and the minimum wage throughout Europe. 7 years later, we have regulated posted workers, and we have common criteria for minimum wage to be set throughout Europe. 7 years ago, he mentioned the regulation of big tech. We've now created a set of European regulation that hold the big platforms to their responsibilities regarding, public discourse and public health. This is the Digital Services Act, and another piece of regulation that is breaking a number of illicit anti-competitive behaviors. This is the Digital Markets Act. As far as green transition was concerned, 7 years ago, he mentioned the border carbon tax and the reciprocity in international trade agreements. 7 years later, we have a carbon tax, a border carbon tax, and we have embedded in our international trade agreements the concept of reciprocity and the obligation to comply with the Paris Agreement. 7 years ago, he committed to create 20 European universities by 2024. We now have 60 European universities. He also mentioned the problem of migrations and asylum, which was a big problem in the wake of the waves of migration triggered by the conflict in the Middle East. 7 years later, we're about, in a few days, to adopt at the European level the Pact on Migration and Asylum that ensures that there is solidarity between the countries of first entry and other countries, and that ensures that there is an effective control at the external borders of the European Union. So what I want to say is that if you want the Europe to change, you can make it change. And of course, you're going to say, if Europe has changed so much, why did the populists rise? I'm going to return the question. What would have happened if Europe had not changed as much as it has changed in the past 7, 10 years, depending on what horizon you want to look back? But what I want to conclude on is that, of course, Europe can change, and you have the power to make it change. You have one ballot, one vote to cast on June 9th of this year, and you should seize this opportunity, because this is the way you can change Europe.
Thank you very much. Luigi.
A few words, first of all, as confession, because, as you said, I was the leader of probably of the biggest populist party in Europe, raised at 33% at the elections in 2018. I was Deputy Prime Minister, Minister of Economic Development, Labour and Foreign Affairs. Even during the Mario Draghi's government, I represented that party. And then I resigned as leader, and I left because of the ambiguous approach of the party about the Russian aggression against Ukraine. I left the party, the Five Star Movement. I founded with the other 70 members of the parliament a new party. Among the points of the political agenda, obviously, there was the unconditioned support to Ukraine against the Russian aggression against Ukraine, and we heavily lost the elections, 0.6%. And so now I'm here, first of all, in order to say that I'm not concerned about it, because thanks to Bernard Spritz, I'm here. Thank you for the invitation, Bernard. Reading the concept of this panel, it's clear that there is a concern about the populist parties that are going to be, in a way, establishment. They are going at the government, probably, or it's possible, no? Might be. I'm not concerned about that, because the populist parties, they are proposing a scheme of agenda where there are, for complex issues, simple solutions. So it works when you are at the opposition. When you go at the government, you have no money, you have to respect the constitutions, the European framework of regulation, the rule of law, and indeed, usually they gain votes during the opposition period and they lose votes during the government's period. I'm more concerned about the traditional parties in Europe, of what they are doing, because obviously it's not in general, but there are some cases where, in order to face this era of the populist parties, some traditional families are approaching the issues with the same style or line. And this is dangerous, because the populism is a phase. Every time is a phase. It was a phase after the subprime crisis, financial crisis in 2011. And it's a phase now in another form, because at the time it was more populism, now is more sovereignism, if I may. But in any case, it's a phase after the inflation and gas crisis because of the Russian aggression against Ukraine. So for economic issues, this is my assessment, but this is my opinion. I'm concerned because we need the traditional families at the European level, and we need that they don't alter too much their DNA in order to face the issues with the same style of the populist parties. And this is why my concern, and I hope that we will have the opportunity to discuss, is that now the only one way in order to face the current era is to continue to work on the long term for sustainable solutions to complex issues. And when I speak about sustainable solutions, of course, we have to speak about reforms, but reforms of the European system, first of all, because if we are speaking about the enlargement over the 27 member states, it's impossible to continue this method, this decisional method, for instance. And about Ukraine, some leaderships that are not coming from the populist parties at the European level are spending more time saying which kind of weapons we will not send to the Ukrainians, rather than take an initiative in order to push back Putin from Ukraine and try to save this Europe, because he's not just attacking Ukraine, he's already attacking Europe. This is because I'm perceiving a concern. The concern that populist parties are raising votes. Yes, because something was wrong, probably. But the solution is not to be the bad copy of the populist parties, because between the bad copy and the real ones, the voters will continue to vote the real ones if they want to vote for the populism. And this is even another point about the green transition. I think that we have the most advanced legislation in terms of green transition at world level as European Union. But now my perception is that we are a little bit scared of what we did. And because of, obviously, is normal that there are protests, that there are people that are against the green transition. It's possible. It's a right, no, in the democracy. But the illusion that now, stepping back, the farmers will vote for the traditional families in Europe is just an illusion. We should keep our positions and we should keep continuing the line that we adopted during the last years. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let's hear from Germany now, as it were. Nils, how would you answer these questions?
Well, first of all, I would like to join my friend Jean-Noël Barrot's analysis on Europe getting stronger over the last 5 years, since the last European elections. And indeed, Europe has shown that it can protect European peoples during a period of profound change and transformation, and formulating new answers to unprecedented challenges, be it climate change, be it the pandemic, be it Russia's war against Ukraine. That's quite impressive. And so, to a certain extent, the European Union has risen to the challenge of countering populist forces by giving better answers on the European level. And we should give President Macron full credit for his initiative via the Sorbonne speech, and especially via the concept of European sovereignty, which was taken over by Olaf Scholz during his campaign in 2021, was part of the SPD's electoral platform back then. It's part of the coalition agreement, and don't forget, in Germany, there's a sort of political Bible called the coalition agreement, more than 100 pages, which we have to stick to. So I think he really laid the ground for this new departure for the European Union. At the same time, the rise of populism in European nation states has continued right up to now. So we have more populists being part of European national governments than before. We have rather high polls and also electoral successes by populist parties, right-wing, especially right-wing populist parties, but also left-wing populist parties, even here in France. at the last parliamentary election. So this brings us back to the real causes of populism, which is very much about national politics, about how national governments deal with challenges arising from the transformation of the economy, of the energy sector, of transportation, the future of the automobile industry, the future of energy supplies, the future of the workplace, because of digitalization and stuff like that, and lack of public investment in education, in infrastructure, and so on and so on. And these issues have only partly be addressed by national governments and can only be partly addressed by the European Union. So there's a lot of work to do to mitigate the rise of populist forces across Europe by national politics. And in my view, one of the key aspects is the territorial dimension of social security. We talk a lot about the level of support we give to certain groups in society, rightly so, but it's not only about the amount of the minimum wage, it's also about the presence of public administration throughout the country in rural areas. So when there's no bus coming, you feel not very well equipped, even if you have a high minimum wage and a lot of social subsidies being handed out. The same is true for lack of hospitals or closing down of hospitals, lack of higher education institutions and stuff like that. And I think this is an issue which also is very much prevalent across many European countries, at least the larger ones by nature. And this needs to be addressed by national governments with the help of the European Union, but it's very much a domestic policy issue.
Thank you very much. Let's hear from Renu now, and obviously a little bit about what on earth happened in the Netherlands would be welcome.
Yes. Yeah, you raised 3 questions, but first of all, let me say thank you for allowing me to speak to you today. I'm delighted and it's an honor. The 3 questions you asked are, is it inevitable? Does it matter? And what can we do about it? And in answering those questions, I'll try to weave in some of the things that happened in the Netherlands, because I think part of the solution that I'm proposing can be found in lessons that we learned from the recent horrible election result in the Netherlands, where Geert Wilders with the PVV, a far-right party, became the biggest. So let me start by saying, is it inevitable? I think 6 years ago when Brexit happened, a lot of people thought that wouldn't happen, but from bad things, good things can come. And one of them was that a lot of young people woke up and thought to themselves, shit, what is going on? We need to change. We need to do something about this. And I was one of those people. I quit my job in the private sector, which was a lot more comfortable and a lot less risky, to dive into this project of a European political party that works towards one European parliamentary democracy. And many people told me this will never happen. For example, when we talked about uniting EU defenses, people said, this is something that's so unlikely, you're naive, stop dreaming. And now, after the horrible invasion of Ukraine by Russia, all of a sudden the public opinion on that has shifted quite a bit. And generally in history, a lot of things that seem inevitable can happen or can eventually not happen. So 70 years ago, nobody predicted that the EU would be so successful in managing to keep European countries from shooting at each other and fighting horrible wars. Another example is that people thought it would be impossible that the Soviet Union would fall apart without a lot of bloodshed. And so things do not always go as you might think they go, or as experts might say. And the key factor in determining whether it will go a certain way or not is people, individual people that take actions. So is it inevitable? Definitely not. We have 2 months left, and everybody here in this room can do something about it. By encouraging your friends to go and vote, to light up discussions online or on the streets, to join political parties and actively be involved in civic engagement. But before going into what we can do about it and talking a bit about the Dutch election result, does it matter? It matters an awful lot. Although the most important decisions in the EU are still taken inside the European Council, so the heads of states and the governments are determining the course for the biggest, in the biggest way, the European Parliament still will play a massive role. And there's three key issues for me. It's the war in Ukraine. Our fundamental values are under attack, and we need to do everything we can to support Ukraine. The second thing is climate change. We see the Parliament and the governments now backtracking on some of the legislation, and that's awful. We need to double down and fight climate change. That's one of the two main priorities. And the third one is the future of the EU, which will largely be determined in the next 5 years as well, and where the European Parliament will play a big role. Now, on to the Dutch election results and what we can do about it. I think Mr. Di Maio was very right about traditional center parties. In the Netherlands, we've seen that they've tried to copy Geert Wilders' party, and in the end, they made him big. They made him from an outsider who was not really relevant but shouted a lot to somebody who's now in the center stage of politics in the Netherlands. But to add to that analysis, which is right, I think what have other more progressive pro-European parties opposed, or what kind of vision have they brought that opposes the vision of these populists? It has been a story of cold showers, losing your favorite food, of not being able to fly to your favorite holiday destination. And that is not an appealing story at all. So what we can do is not only be actively involved in citizen engagement in these elections, but also work on compelling visions for the future of Europe about how we can make a clean economy that will benefit all of the European citizens and tell stories that people want to join and want to be part of. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. Let's go back to the Minister and perhaps push this a little bit further, because one of the things that's very striking in your answer is it's a lot about results, it's about putting in place things that you have promised, it's about respect for public engagements, it's about technical progress, or technical progress in the sense of, you know, putting in place solutions. But sometimes, you know, as Renu just said, it's much more complicated to sell that kind of politics when you're up against the emotion, the easy narratives, the slogans of populism. How do you get past that tension in trying to counter the power of populism?
So my point was not to say that there has been technical advancements of Europe or administrative footsteps. My point that Nils added to was to say that Europe has changed profoundly, and that what we've decided to do is to take back control, if I may borrow this expression from our British neighbors. Take back control on a number of questions that were left unanswered 7 years ago. And when Europe seemed powerless, then European citizens that are not dumb understand that they are losing control. So there was urgency to take back control. And if I go back to what Nils was saying about European sovereignty or strategic autonomy, these were concepts that were forbidden in Brussels and Strasbourg, a couple of years back. But they've gradually, of course, mostly due to the emergence of the COVID crisis and the aggression war in Ukraine, they've become common language. And the Europeans, especially, driven by the German, French leadership, have decided to take back control on their dependencies, on stuff that people could no longer understand that we cannot provide, even in times of crisis, because they are so basic. And so we decided to implement industrial policy and to sort of wake up our defense, industrial and technological base. And this seems very natural and very obvious by now. But again, 7 years ago, it was not obvious at all that European democratically elected leaders would decide on a number of key sectors where they would reinvest in order to reduce their dependencies. Because what Nils was saying is very important, but cannot be solved only at a European level. The fact that there are schools and buses and hospitals functioning, please do not put this on the back of Europe, right? But the feeling that a German, a French, a Dutch or Italian citizen is going to have when there is no bus coming and when there is a European continent that is unable to produce something as simple as a mask is the same, is the feeling that there is a loss of control. And so the best argument that we can oppose to the populist speech, which have, by the way, demonstrated in no, or shown or showcased in no countries in Europe that they could do better than what the reformists or what the other political parties can do. The best thing we can do to oppose the rise of populist parties is to start by showing to our citizens that there are ways to take back control. So it's not an easy task. And it's very challenging to know what should be done at the national level, what should be done at the European level, what should be decentralized in a country like France, to the regional level, to achieve, for instance, in certain public policies, the level of efficiency that Germany is delivering, for instance. So we need to challenge our habits in order to take back control on public policies. But this is not inevitable, and wherever they have succeeded in the ballot boxes, the populists have taken either of two paths, either total failure and being kicked out of government at the next election, or completely change the course of their actions and completely change their discourse to basically converge with the agenda that other governments, reformist governments in Europe are pushing for.
While we're with you, can I just introduce an idea that Luigi raised, and that's the war and where populists have come down in this particular conflict. How far is the sympathy, the Russian sympathy that's historically been present at the extremes on the far left and the far right, how far is that damaging to populism? How far has that been a difficult domestic consideration for a country like France?
Is the question whether the aggression war of Russia on Ukraine going to stop the rise of populism in Europe? I think the answer is no. But one thing is for sure, is that what this aggression war is reminding us is that we were mentioning industrial policy and strategic autonomy. We had become used to buying masks and other basic stuff from regions very, very, very far away and not caring as to whether we can produce in times of emergencies, these kind of things. This is what we've learned from the COVID crisis. One thing that we are learning from what's happening in Ukraine is that there is another thing that we are taking for granted, but that is not for granted and that we are going to need to fight for, in particular, in growing our industrial and technological defense bases in Europe. And that is democracy, that is freedom, that is an international order that is, respecting borders, for instance. We thought, I grew up thinking that this was obvious, this was a habit, this would never go away. Now, given the level of threat, if you travel to the eastern flank of the European Union, you realize very soon that in the same way as our grandparents have fought to build this area, this political organization that guarantees democracy and freedom, that to a certain level, we are going to need to engage and fight to ensure that it can stay this way and that we can sort of leave to the next generation the heritage that we received from the previous one.
Thank you very much. Luigi, the minister mentioned that populists once in office can sometimes change. What's your assessment of the Meloni government and how far it in office is different to the way we might have thought it would be?
As you know better than me, Giorgia Meloni was at the opposition for all the time that I was at the government. So it's clear that we were on opposite sides. And even during the Mario Draghi's government, the party of Giorgia Meloni was the only one, or the most important at the opposition among the main four parties in Italy. But I have to say that at the beginning, even during my electoral campaign that I lost, I was concerned about the line about Ukraine. And I have to say that I totally subscribe what the minister just said about the Ukrainian crisis. But I have to say that despite some allies, that it was not easy to manage, the Meloni's government about Ukraine is keeping the position of the Mario Draghi's government. And this is a good news because it's in continuity with not just a point, because I can understand that speaking just about the values sometimes is not clear about what we are speaking. No? Then there are some ones that are speaking about the double standards and others. But if we speak about the Russian aggression against Ukraine as an existential threat for Europe, it's better, in my opinion, together with, in parallel with the point into speaking about values and how we have to defend our values. Because I totally, I can understand the ones that are saying we need a peace negotiating table for Ukraine. Okay, but this is why someone forgot what we did before February 22. Because before February 22, we had almost 10 years of negotiations with Russia, starting with the crisis in Georgia, then the two Minsk agreements. We created the NATO-Russia Council in order to have a dialogue with them. And even at the European Union level, we created a strategy of engagement with Russia about some points that, which in a way were a good field for the collaboration. We already did. I was minister in the period when we tried to avoid the invasion. In the months before the Russian aggression, the Russian invasion, we were in Moscow, all the ministers of foreign affairs, many leaders, as President Macron, Chancellor Scholz were there. We tried to negotiate with them. Now, speaking about the peace negotiating table today, it means that if Zelensky sits at the table now, is to surrender, not to negotiate. But everyone knows that. But this is, again, a simple solution for a complex issue. But at the end, in order to face this existential threat, I'm not saying that we have to send our army there. But in any case, I think that we have the potential, if we express all our potential in terms of support to Zelensky, to Ukraine, we are able to defeat Russia. But we are not doing enough. In words, we are saying enough. In facts, probably as Western community and as European community, we should do more. So for the rest, I have to say that as in the rest of Europe, even in Italy, there is an important part, I don't know if it's the majority, but it's an important part of the public opinion that don't agree with me or what I said now about Ukraine. so there are many parties that they have a different position about Ukraine, not the European Union position. But honestly, yes, I have to say, there is the risk to lose the European elections for those ones today are saying that we need more Europe, we need support more Ukraine, and we need more green transition. But on the long term, is the only sustainable way that we can implement in order to, in order to be on the right side of the history, if I may. It needs time, of course, but the populism, it's a short phase every time. We should work in order to avoid the crises that are generating this growing of consensus for this kind of parties. And this is why I spoke about the reforms, internal reforms, because, for instance, during the COVID crisis, the moderate parties, they grew a lot in terms, they gained a lot of votes because people needed skills, competence at the government level in order to face a huge crisis. The Next Generation EU plan, it was very good news in terms of reaction as European Union against the financial crisis that might happen after the COVID crisis. The problem was that not all the countries were able to implement the national plans because of bureaucracy, because of problems in terms of reforms of the public administration. So we need to work about that. And it's possible to lose the elections on the short term because of that. But looking at the history, then the ones that are resonating in a long-term way, in a long-term direction, they win.
Thanks, Luigi. We're going to have to be a little concise and short in our answers.
Yes.
But Renu, I thought I would just ask you something which a lot of people find puzzling, and that's about young people and populism. There's a very strange correlation in some countries about the youth vote and populist parties. Do you want to have a go at trying to explain that?
Yeah. Two things about that, but we talked a bit earlier, the minister talked about the effect of the war in Ukraine on populism, and interestingly enough, in the top 5 or even the top 10 reasons for Dutch people to vote for Geert Wilders, his Ukraine stance was not even on that. So he's not in favor of giving additional support to Ukraine, but that was not a voting decision basis for his voters, but it is for almost the entire rest of the country. When it comes to young people, in the Netherlands, we have a thing called the school elections. So during elections, high school students, I don't know if it's a thing in other countries, but they can vote as well. In the digital system, it doesn't count for anything, but it does show what high school people, if they would have the only right to vote, what it would be like. And the top 2 parties were not a reflection of the actual result. It was the PVV, which was on the first one, but the second one was the Forum for Democracy, which is even more right-wing populism, out of this world, different universe kind of party. And a lot of that lies in the use of social media. They were, or the Forum for Democracy is one of the only parties that's active on TikTok. And 40% of youth said they get all their news from that platform. So yeah, if other politicians are not there and serious news media aren't there, then they only get fed one type of message. And that message gets enhanced by troll factories. And I think that's something that we're sometimes not aware of. That a recent study, for example, in Germany showed that in 1 month, only on X, more than 1 million fake messages in German were sent from Russia from just trolling factories. And that is actually blowing the wind in the fire of social media content that's projected towards young people.
Thanks very much, and very concise. Nils, let's just look ahead at the towards the European elections and try and think about, you know, what the risks are there. Perhaps you can take us through a little bit how you see that. What's at risk? What's the outlook for the force of populism within the European Parliament in particular?
Well, obviously the European Parliament will reflect in its composition the political landscape in EU member states, and most probably this will lead to a higher level of representation of populist, especially right-wing populist parties. This is just a sort of mechanical effect in terms of democratic representation. And this might lead to more difficult majority finding processes inside the European Parliament, more complex decision making, and it could also affect support for Ukraine, but we'll see to which extent a strong majority for supporting Ukraine will remain in place in the European Parliament. I think in this respect, national governments and national parliaments will remain the more important decision makers. And I think, just to make one observation about the link between populist, right-wing populist movements and Russia, that this admiration for a strongman is not linked to Russia in a very essential way, meaning that they like Russian culture or they want to emigrate to Russia and live there. There's no stream of emigration from any European country towards Russia, obviously. It's more about, it fits into the picture of a authoritarian ruled country with nationalist credentials, with an idea that other peoples are not as great as the own people and stuff like that. And in this respect, it's more in the world of ideas than in the real world, because in reality, Russia is very much a country lagging behind in terms of economic development and technological progress. Just look at the last 20 years in China compared to Russia. And I think this brings us back to the real causes of populism. It's very much about how people feel in a world that is changing very fast and which has a lot of not only technological but also societal change going on, and we need to address this in a more progressive and forward-leaning way instead of just looking back at mythified history. And I think this struggle is already going on in the national political arena, and it will be more going on inside the European Parliament starting in June.
Thanks, Nils. I think we'll give the last word to the Minister. 2 minutes before we close this session a little early. What's at stake at these elections?
Well, I like to say that these are the most important elections since the European Parliament was first elected in 1979 at the universal ballot method. The remark that Nils just made is important. What's going to happen is the ability of the European Parliament to continue on its course of taking back control, carrying ambitious policies for the green transition, changing the course of Europe in terms of strategic autonomy, building up the European industrial defense capacities, and building up the social sort of protections throughout Europe and defending the rule of law. If we have thinner majorities, this will be harder to achieve. But I'd like to end with an optimistic note, because I think that sort of hope and determination and faith is always stronger than fear. And what populists are sort of thriving on is all the fears that are coming from these disruptions of the world we live in. So our responsibility to fight against populism is to build up hope, to display determination, and never to, I think one of the panelists was saying this earlier, never go along with the temptation to adopt the discourse of those of the populist parties, the populist forces, which is the discourse of fear. We are Europeans. We are a great continent. We are a great civilization, and we have much more to gain from the future and to offer to the world.
Thank you very much indeed. I'd like to thank all our panelists. That was a fantastic conversation.